Been up working for the day at our 6-acre site. Just finished up lunch and going to do a little bit more work this afternoon, and I thought it would be fun to share some updates on the large pond. And it is overflowing, and we've worked on the overflow. We worked on the retaining berms and did a whole bunch of little adjustments. So let me show you how that is unfolding. This is the large pond that we started last winter with a skid steer and then tidied up and refined last summer with a little excavator. And today's the first day I've ever seen it completely filled to overflowing. So it's a pretty significant amount of surface area. This is not a very deep pond. It's about 4 or 5 feet deep, maybe 3 to 4 feet right in there. Relatively shallow elsewhere, but a lot of surface area is pond in the middle of the woods now, and it feels really exciting. And so when it's at this full point, it's an opportunity to look at where it's leaking, look at where it wants to overflow, make some adjustments, and actually mark the line. This is the fullest it can ever be, as far as we know, because now the overflows are operable. And so Juan and I went through and marked the high water line in some areas with stone. You can see that area down there. So as the water fluctuates, it won't go any higher than this unless the overflows are completely saturated. Maybe it'll push into those stones an inch or two, but the overflows would be activated. So it'll be actively draining when it gets above those stones. And at first, we were disappointed with the idea of there's just all this bare soil. But we have these bigger stones that we want to harvest and integrate into gardens or into structures, make sun traps and the like. And this morning, very excitedly, Juan and I realized that this is an area that could be developed into a sauna later on. That's the high water line. We could make roughly an 8x8 or an 8x12 space somewhere in here that's bermed with soil and have some of these large stones be the stepping stones to let you go directly into the water. So what at first was a little disappointingly low high water line for this end of the pond seems as though it's revealed itself to be a potential for a really beautiful other pathway that can be taken. And now that we have this dotted line of stones where the highest water will ever be, we can do the next phase with a lot of this, which is to design in the perennial herbaceous layers. They're irises that will go right on the water line, or camas or calamus that can go right at that point, that just slightly below the water line, just slightly above. Plants that will be underwater quite a bit. So we know that now, and so we can finally design that in. And we have no intention of bringing a machine into working in this space, so it's game on for adding in the perennial elements to the edges of this whole space, and that feels really exciting. It's neat to have so much water holding here. So then if the pond is completely full and overflowing, where is it overflowing and how do we interact with that? I'll take a deeper look on the far side over there, but as of this morning, you can see a freshly deposited mini berm. That was something we added with some really good clay subsoil to hold water back from flowing out over there. That isn't exactly where we wanted it to overflow, but it's a nice emergency. If it needs to, it can go out that way now. But our intention was to have clearly none of the water go over the berm, but rather come around the berm. And so this is our spillway. You can see it goes through some pretty dense vegetation, and the water level, when it gets to this point and wants to express higher, can freely come out, come around. We dug this out this morning. You can see it overflowing and running, but not too aggressively. If it were to really, really rush through here and scour, it would tend to deposit out into this area rather than cutting back into the berm, and that is by design. So we have this overflow that is moving itself down along next to a pathway with the chance to really peak flow as needed, and then comes around some trees, goes over some roots, and then we made it take a hard 90. And so this area will dig out a bit, and that can be a place where silt is deposited. You can see with it running, there is a little bit of silt moving through, but not a whole lot. And once it gets down to here, it can run along a garden bed and then meet up with some other overflows and start heading down that way. And so we've got a little bit of a more thoughtful flow and path that the overflow can take. And we are definitely seeing a bit more of the leaking on this end of the berm. So part of the work today was to take the thicker parts of the berm. We didn't get any video while we were doing it because we were just doing it, but this whole section was reduced by about 20 or 30 wheelbarrow loads, and we deposited it here. If you've been following closely, you know that this was a tree that I had some questions about. Very reasonable to say the quote-unquote maybe right thing to have done early on was to cut the tree down and remove it entirely by the roots before we started building the berm. That didn't happen, and that's fine. And what we've decided to do, we know that trees will pass away if their roots cannot get oxygen. And so rather than cutting it down and getting rid of this tree as a physical element, we buried the bottom so we can get more and more berm starting to develop downslope of it. And this tree will ultimately pass away, which is sad for the tree, but it can remain standing as a dead standing snag and be a really nice habitat space for birds and creatures and slowly break down. And I recognize that it's still going to be leaky at the bottom because of that, but hopefully not too leaky. And if we're thoughtful about it, we can think about plants that appreciate a gentle, steady supply of cool groundwater and design a really interesting perennial system for everything downslope of this while the berm slowly but steadily over the years settles in and gets tighter and tighter. Already we were having conversations today with this steady flow of cool water moving through the landscape here of what are some interesting characters. Watercress comes to mind, although it's a bit shady back in here, but maybe there's enough sun for that to be productive. Be cool to hear from you folks. Are there neat context appropriate plants, perennial, ideally food or medicine plants that enjoy cool running water, pretty rich fertile soil in under the shade of pines? Because now we have that opportunity to design into that since we've set these channels in motion. It's the same thing down here where the overflow continues on, runs past this bed, and then meets up with some other overflows and keeps going down. We've got it widening out here a little bit. We still have to trench this out a little bit more to have better drainage since this is a walkway. But we go down through here and make a turn. We realize we can dig this out quite a bit and put tons and tons of silt right next to this waterway. This will be a great place for trees. Maybe some pawpaws or persimmons can go in there. And we can have this section of the overflow system act as a really nice silt trap. Dig this out quite a bit, pretty deep. We don't have to access and walk through here very much. And then we can have that silt as it's caught here added to these trees. So every little step of the way in refining how water can overflow through the system, how it can enter into the pond, dealing with those problems, we're getting all these unique micro contexts that we can design with. It's a compelling challenge. There's a lot of bits to think through, but that can all happen over time. Certainly a lot of water in the landscape, and it's a question as to whether this is from leaking from the pond or just the reality that right now we're in a lot of excess water in the landscape and a lot of thawing happening. I suspect it might be a combo of both. The way the berm was put on this side was not packed super tight, so it could be that's leaking over here too. But we'll see as that goes. We did some changes. We'll watch and see. You can see how moist it is in the walkway right here. And this was the area where it was leaking out a lot earlier. And so we brought some clay, we packed that in, and we can turn this into, with large stones, a step to go down into the pond. This is a very gentle, safe way for smaller people or for animals or for folks with stability questions to be able to enter the pond, rather than the far side where it's like you kind of have to jump in off of a dock. So we'll develop that as we go. This needs to stay open here because this is one of the inputs for this whole pond. You can see it running in at roughly the same pace as it's leaving. So right now the pond is a battery of water that is being actively charged and discharged equally and in a way that feels stable. But yeah, it's coming together, and it's really nice to know that I can absolutely guarantee and not change my mind on this, that we will not bring a machine into this space. Juan and I talked about that today. We're on the same page. It's vegetation, it's shovel work, it's maybe a little wheelbarrow activity here or there, and lots of observation. But this pond is settling into the being that it will be in this landscape, with a neat possibility of a sauna later on. And maybe instead of water tanks on pallets, we move that off, get that plastic and that wood out of the way, and think about a hot tub, a wood-fired hot tub that lives on this pad, that we can fill with a solar panel and a pump into the hot tub, and then have a drainage valve there that sends out to nursery crops. We have nutrient-loaded nursery watering plant stuff. Lots of dreams, lots of layers, but chances are we'll mess around with it and make those things happen. And if we do, we'll share notes as it unfolds. Thank you so much for watching.